Good evening.
I hope you all enjoyed your dinner. Welcome back to campus. I'm a big fan of the West Wing. Such a big fan that I'm also a fan of the West Wing Weekly, the podcast that discusses the show. So about 3 years ago, I was listening to the podcast hosts discuss an episode called The Dead Irish Writers. In that episode, they brought up the Super Collider from Texas that had been under construction. And that always kind of intrigued me. And I was thrilled when the podcast host was speaking to the writer of that episode and said, "Why the Super Collider?" And the writer, Eli Attie, said, "I come from a family of scientists, and I try and take advantage of every opportunity that I have to get science into the pop culture whenever possible." And he went on to discuss his passion for science, scientific writing, and I thought, with my background doing communication work here at Northwestern, what a great speaker he would be. So I reached out, and through Twitter and email, I said, "Would you come speak at Northwestern?" And he very politely said, "I'd love to, I'm too busy. Ask me again, though." So I marked it on my calendar. Email Eli Attie. And it's true, I had a little alarm that went off every 6 months. And I emailed Eli Attie, and I said, "How about now?" That started 2 years ago. So you can imagine my excitement and thrill to be able to welcome Eli Attie here today. So Eli is here with us this evening, and he'll be meeting with graduate students tomorrow for an interdisciplinary event organized by Ideas, CIERA, and attended by students from the School of Communication, Department of Radio, TV, and Film, the School of Education and Social Policy, and others. It's a big event here. But tonight, we're going to have him on stage in a conversation on science and pop culture facilitated by our NRT program director and founding director of CIERA, Northwestern's Astrophysics Research Center. Vicky is a computational data science astrophysicist and has worked on the discovery of black hole collisions with the detection of gravitational waves by LIGO. She spends a lot of time explaining to the public how we listen to Einstein's universe and has always been very supportive of my efforts of advancing science communication at Northwestern and beyond. Eli Attie is an Emmy Award-winning writer and former political operative. He was Vice President Al Gore's chief speechwriter and a longtime writer and producer of both Fox TV's House MD and NBC-TV's The West Wing. While attending Harvard College, Eli was an editor of the Harvard Crimson. So please help me in welcoming Ideas PI and CIERA Director, Dr. Vicky Kalogera and Mr. Eli Attie.
You take this one. Our mics are on.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Hi, Eli.
Pleasure. After all the emails and
After all the years, I am grateful to Michelle for being a stalker and being successful for bringing Eli to this event and making the timing work with our NRT conference.
it's funny because the West Wing, I don't know if anybody here, other than Michelle, is a fan or watched the show. We went up here a very long time ago now, and then this podcast started a few years ago. One of the actors from the show, and a guy who had some successful podcasts, started going episode by episode through the whole series. It's taken almost as long as the show took, and it's ending soon, and it feels like the show's ending again. We've all been sort of reliving it and having all these kind of gatherings, but
That's wonderful.
it brought me here, so.
So we're happy to have you here. I normally I've never done an interview before. I have sat in your shoes being an interviewee. Now I'm an interviewer tonight, and I can tell you it's much more stressful to be an interviewer than being an interviewee. Because as an interviewee, you just sit there and you say, I'll just respond to whatever questions come my way. While I actually had to put some thought into this with Michelle's help. So, let's start maybe from early on. So you come, Michelle mentioned, you come from a family of scientists, but it's actually a family of scientists and artists.
That's right.
Nature, and you yourself are not a scientist.
No, I'm not.
So I'm gonna ask you, how did it feel, growing up? Were you conscious of the maybe the duality, or was it all a continuum of people do different things? And did you notice whether you had a different perspective towards science compared to your peers at the time, as a child, as a teenager?
I actually think growing up, so my immediate family, both my parents are artists. My brother became a scientist. He's a mathematician and does work in bioinformatics. But growing up, he was interested in a lot of things and maybe just starting to move in that direction. I was like most kids, I think I was terrified of math and science. I never thought I was good at them. I found them very intimidating, even through high school and college, to the extent that I could get away with the easiest, dumbest course in those areas possible. The kinds of college courses where in the sciences that were just for people like me to fulfill the requirement, where you wrote papers instead of taking tests. They were more sort of conceptual. So in my extended family, I had a ton of scientists, doctors, research scientists, a very close cousin who was a biochemist at the University of Wisconsin, actually, another close cousin who is an MD but does research into human growth hormone and works for a lot of sort of biotech companies. So I think I kind of took it for granted and didn't even know if I had a point of view on it. And really what happened, it's funny, we were talking about this a little bit at dinner tonight, when I was in politics, and particularly when I was working for Al Gore, he was very interested as part of the Clinton administration, and so was Bill Clinton, but Gore in particular, with funding for biomedical research, and beyond that, trying to make as much money, trying to set aside as much money in the federal budget as they could for undirected biomedical research. At least that's the way they made it seem. And I ended up writing a number of speeches about it, and the importance of pools of money. It's so easy when you're a politician to say, well, this is going to be $100 million for cancer research, or this is going to be for research into HIV and AIDS. And then there's a constituency, and you can brag about it in a speech, and people vote for you. But any scientist knows, well, I didn't know at that time, that the real discoveries in those fields are made by people who have no idea what they're researching when they start, and they're just chasing the truth, basically, wherever it lies. And so when I had to write speeches about it, and the information was kind of fed to me by Al Gore, basically, it just sort of struck me that, oh, this is what all these people in my family are doing all the time, and this is why it matters. And I was able to call up my brother and say, guess what? Al Gore just got all this money in the federal budget, and it sort of seemed, I was almost coming home to something that was a part of my life that I didn't know about. So I think that excitement about getting it for the first time, even in a very dumb sort of lay way, was probably what I ended up taking with me when I left government and politics and got into screenwriting. And there are other reasons that I became interested in science as a topic of screenwriting, but I think at that point I realized, oh, this is something I have a personal connection to, and it's a good thing. It's not just this oppressive class that I'm worried I'm going to fail.
That's so interesting. So I had not realized. So this realization for you happened during your career as a speechwriter for Al Gore.
Absolutely
you
right.
You were not looking for that connection.
Not even close.
You were maybe avoiding science.
Well, I will say this, and this is true of a lot of people here. It's hard for me to know, but everything in my career and in my life that of any value happened by accident. Working in politics was a total accident. funny thing in my case is that I come from a family with a lot of scientists and artists and musicians, and just for some reason, not a lot of conventional. I don't know what's conventional, I guess, but nobody in my family wore a dark suit and went to an office all day. And then I got out of college and wore a dark suit and went to an office all day, working for politicians. That made me sort of a black sheep in my family. And I think it was because in the beginning, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and by the end of college, I just thought, well, I'll go to law school because everybody else seems to want to go to law school. And I never went. I applied, but then at the last minute, I was applying to law school and working in government and politics, and I thought, well, this is pretty fun. Why do I have to go back to school? I can just do this for a while. And so one thing led to another. So, the Al Gore job is another example. I wasn't looking to work for Al Gore even. I was working in the Clinton White House. I worked for Bill Clinton for about a year, and I was going to leave and take a job in a political consulting firm, and really had one foot out the door when somebody said, you should interview for this job, and Al Gore's speechwriter was leaving, and I had coffee with him, and kind of so all those issues and all those things that Gore was working on, which I became very steeped in, climate change and scientific research, and he has lots of scientific interest, chaos theory, all kinds of crazy things for a politician to be interested in, came to me entirely because of him, which was a fluke.
So in your speech writing for Gore, sometimes, not always obviously, there were science themes in the speech writing.
Yes.
So where you just said you were getting the information from Al Gore, I would have imagined maybe you were consulting with scientists.
Well, yes and no. I mean, being a speechwriter is a very complicated job. Maybe because, like being a TV writer, there's no rule book for it. Yeah. There's no structure.
What was your major?
I majored in something called social studies. Which, when you tell people that, they think, oh, you colored in maps and learned about Eskimos. But it was actually where I went to college in the 1960s. The government department was very right-wing, and in the countercultural days of the 60s, some people, some sort of hippie-ish, idealistic professors decided to start a left-wing major that would be for people kind of interested in political and social theory, but where you wouldn't have to, even when I was in college, I feel like the government department there was, they wanted women bare feet, and it was very, actually, the head of the government department at Harvard when I was in college, I remember said in the student paper, which I was working for, there shouldn't be a women's studies major. Like, it's basically an illegitimate, they were very right-wing and they were very kind of paleo. So the social studies department, you read Karl Marx and Max Weber, and it was almost comically left-wing, but really fun, and you got to kind of cobble together your own program by pulling courses from a lot of different things.
Okay.
So that's what I did. It prepared me for nothing, actually. It was just sort of like read a bunch of books and, but I think for me, if you're not going to be like an astrophysicist, I think it by and large doesn't matter what you study in college, as long as you learn how to study, as long as you learn how to collect ideas and interact with people, communicate with people. Yeah. So
going back to the speech writing.
Right, but also you raise an interesting point, which is that there were tons of experts in science. It's funny because there's an episode of The West Wing that is, I can't remember the title of the episode, I'm sure it was covered on this podcast. It was an early episode of the show, the first couple of years, or at least right around the time I started there, that was about the Martin Sheen character on The West Wing trying to basically propose some giant government initiative to cure cancer. And I don't remember all the details of the West Wing episode, but it was entirely based on an experience I had when Al Gore wanted to give a speech basically announcing a massive government effort to cure cancer. And what they essentially did is me and a couple of policy people, we had to deal with the head of the NIH, we had to deal with all the White House science advisors, we had to deal with all these people. They were all from within the government, but some very smart and celebrated scientists who beat us into the ground and basically said, you can't do that, and it's disrespectful for people with cancer to say you're going to cure it, because maybe they still have it, and what about just managing it? And at the end of the day, like, if you'd given this speech, which I don't even know who gave, it would have just been the lamest, limpest. You know, it would have been like, we don't like cancer. And so I think it was often my job as a speechwriter. I mean, Gore would tell me what he wanted to say, and he was really, I loved him, that he was a micromanager with his own speeches, which he should have been. You know, we had these, we pulled all-nighters. You know, it was unhealthy for somebody in this position. But I would have to talk to the experts as an idiot, kind of. And say, okay, you know, I don't know anything about cancer research, head of the NIH who does this 18 hours a day, but I'm going to need to write this speech about it. So explain it to me. And when those people would then, you know, try to get a draft of the speech and try to get technical language and jargon in there, but wait a minute, in fiscal year this, we're going to do that, I would basically say, we're not saying that, you know, because Al Gore's going to look like a fool if he tries to talk that way. So my job, with a lot of authority from Al Gore, was to protect his voice, to make him sound like a leader and not a wonk. And people had to come down to my level. And it's something that I found early on in screenwriting and in TV writing. When I first started working on The West Wing, I was coming right out of the White House, basically. And the show had been on the air for 2 years and was a big hit show. And Aaron Sorkin, like my third day or something, Aaron Sorkin came into the writer's room and said, I'm writing a scene and I need a list of this fictional president's accomplishments in his first few years in office. And he just looked at me and said, well, you know, would you want to write something up for me? And then he left. And he walked out and I thought, well, he's written this show for 2 years. Doesn't he know? Aren't there things the president did on the show? And I realized that Aaron Sorkin, the screenwriter, kept his head pretty empty of politics and government. He's a brilliant guy, because he wanted to always be the audience. He wanted to always be outside of it. So if somebody whispered something in his ear to put in a scene a year ago, he deliberately didn't remember it, because that wasn't his concern. His concern was telling the story, you know, only using enough that, you know, the audience heard what he wanted them to hear and didn't get lost in it. Or if he wanted them to get lost in it, the audience knowing that wasn't something they were supposed to pay attention to. So I think I had experience with that as a speechwriter, because, you know, one day I'd be with the head of the NIH, and then the next day I'd be with a bunch of economic advisors, and then the next day I'd be with a bunch of, you know, I don't know, people from the agriculture department, because we were going to Iowa. So I always needed to stay on the surface and boil down someone's life's work into like a sentence and a half that an idiot can understand.
So since, you know, science communication is something that a lot of the NLP programs are thinking about, how was your experience in communicating with these experts, both in terms of you as a not-scientist trying to absorb their expert opinion and boiling it down to a sentence and a half, but also what was your experience with them trying to teach you or communicate their message to you? Was it frustrating and difficult?
It just depended, you know. It's a funny thing, because, you know, I was mentioning this when we were talking earlier. I have a brother who's a brilliant mathematician and bioinformaticist, if that's a word, and he writes all these great papers and they're cited, and can't explain to anybody what he's working on. I remember he once said to me years ago, I was sort of pressing him on a math paper that he was writing, because I just didn't understand what he was talking about. And I said, can you draw something for me? And he basically said, if you have to visualize it, you just can't understand it. And at that point I was like, you know, check please. And I had a cousin who's a biochemist who's really great at breaking it down for a lay person and, you know, making these kind of very abstract concepts real. It's the same in government, or if you're sitting down with a bunch of scientists who are being brought into government to advise on something. Some people are able to do it and some people aren't. Some people you realize after 20 minutes, if you have limited time and you're trying to get a speech written on a deadline, I gotta end this conversation and find somebody else, you know, because you need people to break it down for you. And usually it's simple enough that you could probably draw it out, or bully them in the sense of you're just going to write something anyway and then show it to them and make them just tell you what has to be changed. But nothing is better and nothing is rarer than somebody in, cancer research is a pretty broad area, but somebody in astrophysics or something to do with NASA who can, really make it come alive and help you tell that story. And if you meet those people, I'll tell you as a screenwriter, I know a couple of people like that. And I just call them all the time about all kinds of things because they're just the people who collect that kind of scientific knowledge and know what's exciting and gather in their head anecdotes and sort of illustrative examples, and it's storytelling, and some scientists develop it and some don't, and maybe they just don't bother because it doesn't matter to their papers if they don't.
So I don't have to tell the audience, but many of us in the audience, myself included, we know that actually this is not just like being a scientist or being a writer or being maybe a painter or a musician. It's not you're either born with it or you're not. You can be trained in it. You can be trained to be a good communicator. If you've never put time in it, if you've never worked on it, if you've never tried or engaged or thought about it, then you may be able to do it because it just happens, or you may not. But if you do get the training, if you do make the effort, you can actually become a lot better. And this is what we're trying to do in these programs.
I think
this is part of what we're trying to do in these programs.
No, and it's especially given my own experience with my family members all over the map and their different abilities to communicate what they do just to me over Thanksgiving dinner table. When I was a speechwriter, I think it's almost like this kind of Zen lesson about life, probably to some degree, that everything is a version of just being open and listening and just taking in what's around you. And if you're, this guy I know who was a doctor but does all kinds of interesting research and has almost like other scientific hobbies. He's like an inventor and he works for companies and works at Stanford also. This guy John Sotos, who was a consultant to House, the medical show that I worked on, he just collects facts about things. I remember having a conversation with him about the dawn of flight, and he just was fascinated by it and was talking about the sort of fatality rates in the dawn of flight and how it was so much more acceptable for people to die basically on test flights. And he gave me some rough statistic, I don't know if it was 1,000 people a year or something or a month, but how fast the technology advanced because they were willing to take these huge risks. He wasn't saying it was good or bad, but there's a certain type of person who just, when they hear something like that, they never forget it. Mm-hmm. When they see an illustrative anecdote, they feel it, and they always use it. And I think when I was a speechwriter, my job was looking for social data, reading newspapers and seeing, oh, here's an interesting trend in the culture. Here's an interesting sob story about someone whose child caught a stray bullet in some violent neighborhood. And you gather these things and you clip them, and you're always looking for things that are going to help you tell a certain kind of story, but usually a very serious story with a lot of stakes that you can commit billions of dollars to solving these problems, right? The minute I became a TV writer and a screenwriter, I realized that I was certainly looking for that stuff, but suddenly I'm also looking for just weird absurdity and humor. And I was passing a restaurant the other night. I was walking with my wife and just passed a table in Silver Lake in this hipster part of Los Angeles, and just overheard a single sentence, this couple, and the guy was saying, I only wear women's clothing at Burning Man. and I'm going to remember that. I don't know if I'll ever use it. That's not something I would have remembered if I was working in the government, which is all a long, elaborate way of saying that I think as a scientist, if you want to tell a story about science that's going to move people and motivate people, and you're spending your day around scientists and you're reading about science, all that stuff is out there. You just have to see it and grab it. And you just have to keep your brain open enough that when you see it, or when you hear a professor say it, or when you hear a colleague say it, you just file it away and steal it, frankly, because everything is stolen. So, I'm just basically saying steal. That's my message.
So you already mentioned, I have a little piece of paper here that I'm not looking at it. I can't even read it without my glasses. But I know there's a question in here, which is the following. How do you, as a speechwriter in the White House, you talk to experts who were working on the topics that the speech would be about. When it came to TV, or movie script writing, you also you brought science into that writing. And you talked already, mentioned you had at least a few science advisors. How do you seek them out? Not that I'm looking for a job.
The advisors. Usually it starts by handing you a large envelope of cash. No. No, I'm kidding. So the advisors, it depends what you're working on. So The West Wing, I wasn't there when the show began, but it began.
Or House, or
Right, but in the case of The West Wing, that's a show. Well, let me take House as an example. It's probably a better example because it's about science. So actually, House was partly based on a series of columns in the New York Times, which is still running, called Diagnosis, by a woman named Lisa Sanders, who is at Yale, medical school professor, and sees patients still, and she just is fascinated by, I believe what she focuses on are what doctors call zebras, which are not necessarily weird diseases, but weird presentations of diseases. The saying doctors use is when you hear hoof beats, think horses, not zebras. It's probably the most obvious thing, but sometimes it's a zebra. And so that's what she writes about a lot. So they made a deal with her from the beginning to use her columns and to use her as an advisor. Then one of the producers had worked on a medical show that was very short-lived a few years before House, and knew this other guy whose name is David Foster, who's a doctor transitioning into becoming a TV writer by himself. And so in the early days of House, they were the advisors. One of them was the full-time writer on the show, David Foster. The other, Lisa Sanders, lived in Connecticut and taught at Yale and was somebody you could call on the phone. By the time I got to the show, which was a few seasons in, you had Lisa, you had David. They brought on another guy, this guy John Sotos that I mentioned, and I think actually he'd written books about zebras. And I think one of the other writers had just read one of his books, thought it was fascinating, called him out of the blue, and then he was so great, suggested to the show we should make a deal with this guy. And but any TV show I've worked on, like I worked on House for 5 seasons. I called we had 4 medical advisors. I used them all the time. There's no single episode I wrote where I didn't talk to all 4 of them. But I would also be working on something that had to do with gastroenterology. And so I would ask those 4 consultants, or my cousins who were doctors in LA, do you know any gastroenterologists? And I would just call them, and I would say, hey, I'm calling, I work on this TV show, or you know my cousin, or something. And it's amazing how people will just give you their time for things like that. And all names will be changed to protect the innocent. People will tell you stories because it's never going to be, any secret they tell, no one's going to be able to trace it back. Almost never. I can tell stories about that. But, so a lot of it is just finagling. You get some of your best research from people who aren't your consultants. But consultants, it's often just a friend of a friend or somebody. But I actually was working on a pilot script for a legal TV show. It was an idea of mine that never got made and never moved forward. And I hired the absolute wrong legal consultant. It was somebody, I got the studio to make a deal with a lawyer, somebody I knew, and they were useless. They were just not able to make anything come alive. They always seemed busy. They always seemed like they didn't have anything to share. I would ask them a question and say, I'll have to think about it, and then I'd never hear back from them. So I think if you're developing something, if you're working on something, you reach out and talk to as many people as possible. It is going to be 1 in 8 who's going to really be discursive and have anecdotes and have an observer's mentality so that they've stored up stories. When I was in politics, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was storing up stories and anecdotes. I loved to have dinner with all my friends and we'd tell each other the crazy stories that had happened to us that day or that week. And so when I started in screenwriting, I had 1 million of them in reserve on my own. That's what that takes.
Yeah.
It takes that kind of interest.
So you mentioned, or Michelle, I think, mentioned one of the West Wing episodes was on the Super Collider.
Yes.
The physicists among us know that story. You didn't have any physicists in your family.
No, and
how did that happen? Maybe you can tell us.
As far as I recall, it's simply, and I don't even remember the episode.
So I guess the broader question is, how does this idea, in a TV series which was not all about science?
Right, not at all.
How do you choose? How do you make these decisions? Okay, I'm going to write an episode
Here's what
about
happened.
this. It will be about science, and
So,
it will be about this topic.
The episode wasn't largely about science, and I actually didn't write the episode.
Oh.
But it was very early. I can't remember, my name might have been on it. I don't think it was though. But it was very early in my time on the West Wing. And when I got to the West Wing, which was a very unusual show in its time and even would be now, because it would do stories about things like census sampling. It might not be the main storyline, but there was a storyline in one episode about some odd movement, which was a real thing, to abolish the penny. I think the West Wing took a perverse, it was all Aaron Sorkin. He and the show, on his behalf, took a perverse pride in being able to milk entertainment out of really dry, kind of abstruse material. And nobody else would have done stories about that material. And so by the time I got there, that had been well established, and it was kind of trying to be the anti-TV show. Network, the network president of the network it was on, NBC, would sometimes call Aaron, who didn't really like to take the call from the network president, or other people, and say, could there be more romance on the show? Could there be sex on the show? And he would want to do a story about census sampling. And I think it was just defying convention. It's not because he was interested in census sampling. I think it was a kind of an odd, just contrarian, like, I'm going to do what I want and you can go to hell, basically. And so I read an article somewhere that was about like a senator, I think it was about one senator blocking funding for the superconducting super collider, which I knew nothing about. I read this one article and maybe a second article. Maybe I called my brother, but I don't think I had done that yet. And I went into Aaron's office with another writer who was more senior to me, but I said to Aaron, we were just pitching ideas, and I said to him something like, there comes a time in the life of every great TV show when it has to do its episode about the superconducting super collider. And he said, I said almost exactly that, and he said to me, I have no idea where this is going, but we're doing this story. and he probably regretted saying that, because then I went and I figured out, because I was new to screenwriting. When I showed up at the West Wing, I'd never written a script, and I think at this point I still had not written a script. So I was learning how the stories worked, and I was more a part of his brain trust in the beginning as I was learning. But I think I came up with a bunch of scenes, or like the structure of like a C or a D story, not the main story in an episode, that were all about the procedural moves, and here's how the senator blocks the funding, and here's how we get it unblocked. And Aaron was really struggling with what's the human story. And I wasn't at the point yet where I was thinking in those terms. So he made it something about, like, Rob Lowe had a mentor who was dying of cancer, and his dream was to get the superconducting super collider funded, and it was all about, will he meet this guy's dying wish? So most people who watched the episode thought, oh, Rob was trying to do something nice for a dying guy. I was just the guy who put the jargon in those scenes. And it all came from a place of just weirdness. But I think it also was a way of, as I guess I must have said on that podcast, sort of honoring the people in my life who lived and breathed these things. And politics was and is even more now a place where substance is kind of rejected. And much more now than when the West Wing was on, truth and science and reality kind of mean nothing anymore. And so for some political agenda to basically block something that really is part of discovering reality and discovering truth, and that always seemed ridiculous to me. In the wake of my sort of revelation in my Al Gore years that actually my brother and cousins weren't crazy.
Mm-hmm. So how, in that transition of writing speeches for real people talking about real issues to writing for TV shows, what is there? I don't know how to formulate this question, but did you have to adjust in your approach?
Yeah, a lot.
And in particular, in how you were incorporating science in it?
Yes, I mean, when you write a speech, it's just an essay. It's just expository writing. You're basically just saying, here's why we need to fund the superconducting supercollider. Mm-hmm. It's, here's what it's going to do for society. Here's what the benefits are. You may paint a rhetorical picture about, exploring the heavens or smashing the atom or, whatever the point is that you're making. But screenwriting is, it's a little bit the lesson of Aaron Sorkin having to stick a dying guy into that storyline. Dramatic storytelling is about people. It's about emotions. It's about conflict, and speechwriting has almost nothing to do with screenwriting, actually. Which, if I'd known that when I tried to go from one to the other, I probably would never have tried it, because they're so different. There's almost the ability to write a sentence is the only thing they have in common. It's really true, because screenwriting is all about it's all about architecture. It's not really about writing. Writing comes in the last 8% of it. Most of it is basically, okay, I'm going to take this character, and he's in this emotional place in the beginning, and he's in that emotional place at the end. How does he change in the course of this story? Then there's a plot that sort of either supports the emotional changes or drives the emotional changes, and then then there have to be twists. You have to stay ahead of your audience. What are the surprises? How, we talk a lot in screenwriting about exposition. Just what is somebody's story? What are the facts of the story? What are the facts of the plot? But how you lay that out, you can't have a character walk on stage and say, here's where I was born, I want the gun now. It all has to come out elegantly, and so the audience doesn't feel it's being, fed that stuff. So you're constantly saying, this goes in that scene, no, it goes over here, but wait, if I put it there, it's more of a surprise. And so I think when you're talking about something like science, like a show like House, which is all about medicine, basically, and can you make it surprising? Can you tell us, can you come up with a weird medical procedure so that a scene where you may even be teaching a little something is memorable and visual? Can you put enough subtext into the science so that it's not dry arguments, but it's you and I are having a fight because only one of us is going to get the promotion. But everything we're saying is science, but you don't have to know the science to know we're fighting over the same job and one of us is going to be right and one of us is going to be wrong. So all the passion comes from that.
Okay.
So, it's at the end of the day, if you can teach somebody something cool about science, that's a beautiful thing. And there needs to be more of that in the world. So everything else is like a delivery system. It's just a way of feeding people spinach, really. I became obsessed. I remember.
Science is the spinach?
Yeah, I think so. It can be. I mean, I remember being really obsessed with something that I read about, I don't know if anybody knows about this, the hygiene hypothesis. Is the hygiene hypothesis anyone's heard of? So it's a relatively new concept, probably in medicine, for maybe the last 8 years or something, maybe a little bit more, that basically says a baby will put dirt in its mouth, put a rock in its mouth, It'll put a stick from the backyard in its mouth. And a lot of parents, especially in the West, will immediately grab the rock and take it away from the baby. But the infants don't, according to this theory, infants don't do things that don't have a biological purpose. So really what the baby is doing is it's programming its own immune system. So if you believe the hygiene hypothesis, we in the industrialized West have become too sanitary. And our immune systems are not being programmed properly in infancy, and that's why we have so much autoimmune disease in the West. That's the theory. So according to this theory, people should be a little more lax about letting their babies put dirt in their mouths. But there also are modern treatments that do things like feed people, or you have patients drink, if they have a Crohn's disease, a glass filled with millions of microscopic worms. And they pass through your system, but they reset the immune system, is the theory. And these things there have been some promising results. Some doctors think it's wacky, some think it's the future. I read this and spent months trying to figure out, how can I build a house episode around this? How can I present it? I thought it would be the coolest thing in the world. We finally cracked the medicine, and it was going to be some version of discovering that a guy's liver was filled with worms, and we think that's the disease that was killing him, and we get rid of all the worms, but the worms were actually keeping him alive. But it was so complicated in the end that all of it enough of it got taken out that I think anybody who saw that episode would have no idea what the hygiene was. But, which is all a way of saying you always are struggling to put complicated things. If you're trying to put complicated things in a TV show or a movie, it's a struggle. Because really people want to see the guy get the girl, and they want to see the two people fight over the job. And it's easy to do that over just silly nonsense, and it's hard to do it over gastroenterology,
And how do you, maybe actually you have partially answered this question, but in screenwriting, in science we care about fidelity and accuracy, etc. In screenwriting, you care about the drama and the sound in space flight, which really doesn't exist,
right,
etc.
Yeah.
So how did you ever struggle with these issues?
Yeah, I think that it's funny, as I was on my way here from the airport today, a cousin of mine called me, who's an MD, but who works in biotech and does a lot of clinical trials, and I told him I was on my way here, and I asked him, we've talked a million times about this over the years, but what do you think of the treatment of science and medicine in movie and TV shows? And he just laughed.
Yeah.
Most of it is nonsense. Most of it is made up. Most of it, I would say the lazier, well, I don't know if I should say it's lazy. A lot of screenwriters, a lot of people making movies and TV shows, they don't care that much about presenting that stuff accurately because they suspect or they think that their audience doesn't care. And that as long as the guy's going to get the girl or whatever, chase the person for the gun, that this can just be a few lines in the background. And they're worrying about other things, and they're focusing on other things. I'm not averse to cutting corners sometimes. It really depends what style of thing you're doing. If you're doing, an episode of Friends, and someone's dating a scientist, it doesn't really matter that much if the science is accurate. If you're doing Chernobyl on HBO, I've never watched it, it matters a lot because you're kind of presenting it as a deep, almost documentary style dive into that subject. So it bothers me that so much of Hollywood on all topics is lazy and doesn't care about getting it right. Sometimes some of the greatest things I've ever seen, they don't worry about that because they're worrying about 20 other things. The Verdict, the Paul Newman movie from I think the early 80s, is one of the greatest movies that's ever been made, I think. And the law is insane. It's a legal story, and Paul Newman in this movie does some things that any lawyer would know not to do if they went to law school for like an hour. But the movie's fantastic. I mean, it's crazy. He actually turns down a settlement offer on behalf of his clients who are crushed and furious and in tears as if they can't fire him in that second. That's you can't do that. But the movie sort of depends on it. And David Mamet wrote it, and he's one of the greatest writers. Right. But he had other things he was working about.
I'm looking at Michelle. Is it time? Yeah, I think I'm looking at the clock. So we're gonna open it up to questions from the audience. And I don't know if we have mics going around. Yes, we do have mics. So you can raise your hand and a mic will come your way and then you can go ahead.
Okay,
Please
cool.
go ahead.
Yeah, I just don't like to yell into these things for that very reason. So thank you very much for your talk. I found it very inspiring. And through the course of it, you've outlined a story where it is your experience speaking to highly specific specialists, at the risk of being redundant, from a point of view of what you said is like one of ignorance, as what you would call maybe a layperson.
Studied ignorance.
Studied ignorance.
Cultivated ignorance.
A lot of my work and the work of a lot of the people that I've talked to here today has been, how do we talk to other specialists from the point of view of being specialists? And I have found that lay people are very easy to talk to because they want to be amazed. They want to be intrigued at what human beings are doing out there. Scientists get very distracted. You want to tell them the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and you say, oh, well, Goldilocks found this house in the woods. They say, what was the house made of? What color was the roof? Where exactly was the house? And you're saying, it doesn't matter. She goes in the house and she sees a bowl of porridge. How big were the bowls? What were the bowls made of? What color were they? What was the arrangement? And it's very challenging to speak to specialists who cannot see the forest for the trees. So in your experience, how can we get around that? How we're setting ourselves up to speak to lay people and policymakers, but they're already very open to talking to us. It's us who don't know how to talk to them. And by that same token, we also don't know how to talk to each other. So how do we get around that?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a very tricky thing. And you know, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking to myself, which is so painfully true from what I do now, that, you know, you don't want to screen the rough cut of your movie to a bunch of screenwriters. You know, it's people who do a thing very deeply, a related thing very deeply, they're thinking of everything, as I probably would, through the prism of how they would do it and what sort of concerns them on a kind of a, you know, very wonky utilitarian level. It's a real problem. I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is that, you know, I come up sometimes with ideas for TV shows or ideas for movies. I have a lot of friends who are actors and screenwriters, and they're not my favorite people to, over dinner, say, hey, can I throw this idea by you? Because they'll either immediately get this distant look like they're thinking about how, oh, I realize now how I can fix the thing I'm working on, or they'll just, you know, react. They'll give you feedback as if it's their work. But to wow those people, you have to be better. That's what I found. You know, if every once in a while, you know, if you have an idea that's amazing, even your cynical screenwriting friends will say, that's an amazing idea. So it's kind of the only advice I can give in that situation, which is it's the ultimate challenge. You have to be so on it, you have to be so vivid, you have to account for the size of the bowls, in a sense, and maybe those are the people you can practice on before you go to the general audiences. And if you can wow them, you can wow anybody. But that's always a problem. It's also people like that are in my experience, not even really the best listeners, because they're usually just thinking about the next thing they're going to say.
Thank you.
Of course.
Other hands, please.
Waiting the microphone over.
Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm interested because obviously you started your career in politics, and putting aside whatever reason you worked for Al Gore, you know, assume it's not party related, party affiliated, but
sort of tragically, there's so much comedy in politics, and there always has been, but now it's so transparent. So I'm curious, if you were forced to go back into speechwriting for some unfortunate reason, out of the existing Democratic candidates or even Trump, who would you most enjoy working for? And who would provide you with the most material for after you left?
Those are two very different questions. Because, you know, one of the weird things about being a speechwriter is, I mean, I suppose it's true in anything you do. There are the people that you enjoy working with, and then there are the things you're sort of proudest you did. You know, some TV shows that I've worked on have been really enjoyable experiences where I'm friends with a lot of the people today, and some you really spill blood, but you look back and you think, I'm glad I was there. The work was good. I think I'll bet the best working experience would probably come from Joe Biden. Because I think Joe Biden, and I know he's not the sexiest of the candidates, and he's also at the center of this crazy Ukrainian made-up, you know, sort of thing about him and his son, at least I think it's made up. I think he's somebody who believes in process. I think he is someone who treats the staff with a lot of decency and probably is a good delegator and lets people do what they know to do. And I feel like a lot of the other candidates, at least the ones who are catching on, are like throw out the rule book types who it would be torturous to work for. Now that's not to say, I mean, I like a lot of things about Elizabeth Warren, and I'm sort of torn about who my candidate might be for 2020. But actually, I think in terms of stories, I think I want to work for Pete Buttigieg. I'm not going to say Trump because no one would believe him as a character. I really think that's true. It's so, yeah, but even if there weren't, it's like nobody would believe that character. He's so insane. What he does has no logic. There's no childhood hurt that explains the sort of crazy acting out. There's no logic, you know, at work. So if you handed in that screenplay, they would basically say, this is gibberish. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But Pete Buttigieg, I think, would be perfect because I don't think he's going to win, which is in some ways a better ending. He has an amazing story. He's totally unexpected. He's outperforming in incredible ways, but he's kind of normal and relatable, and he could be the audience. So I think he would be the perfect lead in a story. But I think Biden would be home by dinner.
So, Biden, do you think you could, if you were working for him, make him exciting as a president?
Well, let's not forget that I did work for Al Gore. And I love Al Gore, but you can kind of only do what you can do. You know, it's a funny thing. Before I worked for Al Gore, I worked for Bill Clinton briefly, and then before that I worked on Capitol Hill. And which was really my first significant job as a speechwriter, and I felt my speeches were very creative. I used a lot of lively language, and I had a great relationship with Dick Gephardt, and it seemed to kind of work. And I thought when I started working for Gore, I read a bunch of his speeches. I thought they were kind of hard to get through. I saw him give a couple speeches, you know, as I was working for Clinton, and I thought, he's like, the bar is so low here. Like, I'll come in and I'll change his life. And it didn't really work out that way. We had a great, long association, which we still have, because he's who he is. He's an adult in his, 50s, and he had to get his head around everything, and it was his work, and it wasn't my work. And even though I was doing it for him 18 hours a day, it all had to go through the filter of his brain. And so many, speech coaches and writers and advisors would be cycled in to try to give him a blood transfusion. He's just the person he is, for better or worse. And he knew that as well, better than anyone. So Biden, how?
So that's a no.
That's a no. That's a no.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, as someone who worked for Al Gore and who also has thought a lot about communicating complicated ideas very broadly, what you make of the failure of the scientific community to convince large swaths of the population that, for instance, climate change is happening, vaccines are good for you, and so on and so forth. What are we failing to do to connect to people who resist those ideas?
You know, I don't think it's science's failure at all. I don't know if anybody saw, maybe about a month ago, Mother Jones did a really powerful cover story on climate change, I thought, that was all about what it's doing to scientists who have worked their whole lives and careers in climate-related fields, and the people who have physically measured the shrinking glaciers and looked at reef beds that were vanishing under the sea, and just people working in the field, that they've really dedicated themselves to this, sometimes with a lot of sacrifice, and they realize no one cares. And they're really going through deep depression and grieving over this. And I think there's two reasons for it. One is that it's so overwhelming, people don't want to deal with it, people don't want to think about it. The average person, I think, can't process it and would rather just watch an episode of, The Big Bang Theory or whatever, or something unsciency. But the other thing is we've entered a place in our politics that started probably a generation ago, where, we have two sets of facts now. The right and left, and I'm of the left, and I believe the left is at least fact-based. But even under George W. Bush, they were talking about the reality-based community versus the sort of the Bushies. People feel they're entitled to their own facts, and it's enabled a whole media and a whole wing of Congress to just ignore what should be flashing red warning signs. And it's really appalling and depressing, and some people say we've got another 12 years before we can't reverse it in any meaningful way, and people should be screaming and shouting about it. But I think the problem, it starts with media, it starts with polarization that is cultural as much as anything else, and some people not wanting to listen to people that they see as elites, because they resent them for various reasons, and it's a real problem, and we should all be really worried.
I know there was one question here, then we'll come back.
I had this question when you talked about the hygiene effect. So it sounds to me like this is a very controversial theory, maybe, and there are a lot of scientific theories like that. So when you write an essay, you can talk about both sides, but when you write a story, there's an outcome and you convey some messages. It seems to me like it's hard to stay unbiased, and so is that a problem at all, and how do you manage to stay unbiased?
Yeah, it's definitely something you think about and worry about. You do get to present both sides in a story because all dramatic stories are about conflict. They're all about I think we should give the experimental treatment with the worms. She thinks it's an abomination and we'll lose our medical licenses if we do it. You can present the arguments in that way, but it's true, especially if you're doing a medical show or something that is about a scientific result, something about the space program, something about like Chernobyl. There's going to be a visual result in the show. So the best I can say is you do the best you can to research it and to try to make sure that you come down on the responsible side. In that particular case, at the time that I was working on that particular episode of House, we had a gastroenterologist come in, and I had already gotten deep into this and said to him, "What do you think about this?" And he said, "It's nonsense, and I've never heard of anything dumber, and don't write that." And then he'd gotten the emails of all the writers. He'd come in to talk to us about bone marrow transplants, even though he was a gastroenterologist because he had one. And he emailed me out of the blue 3 days later, and he said, "I talked to a whole bunch of colleagues, and they sent me some of these studies, and they're kind of amazing." So I felt at that point like it was, there wasn't a verdict in the scientific community yet, but I felt it was promising and not irresponsible, and there was certainly stuff in the literature about it. But where it becomes really difficult is if the story would be best with one outcome, but the responsible thing is another outcome. And that happens sometimes, because stories are voracious beasts that want certain things, and I can definitely think sometimes, not particularly about issues of science, but some policy things, in political material where, actually it was better for the story that the lefty guy got smacked down. But that's actually my point of view, and so sometimes it's hard when you're trying to surprise people and have twists and have certain characters have egg on their face, in a particular moment. You're always wrestling with that.
So we'll take one last question because we're out of time here. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Could you give a bit of a brief timeline or summary of how you got started working in the Clinton administration, going from political outsider to speechwriter?
Well, really for me, it was just that I thought I was going to go to law school. And I ended up, I didn't want to go straight from college to law school for a bunch of reasons. And I just ended up working in government because it wasn't a passion of mine. In college, it wasn't a plan, but I just thought it would be a cool thing to do. I actually worked briefly in the mayor's office in New York City, but then I ended up on Capitol Hill working in Congressman Dick Gephardt's office. And he was at the time the Democratic leader in the House, the minority leader. And I started writing speeches for him, and Washington was a very small community, so if you're in the office of the Democratic leader, White House people are coming over for meetings all the time, and I was making friends. It's a very small transient community of 20-somethings, and I just started meeting people socially who worked in the White House and worked for Clinton. And kind of next thing I knew, somebody offered me a job in the Clinton White House. And so it was really that simple, as it was a small town. It felt like a cottage industry, sort of a company town. And somebody heard about me in the White House, and a friend of mine happened to be there and said, "Oh, he's a friend of mine and he's great, and you should hire him." And I got offered a job. So, it sounds kind of ridiculous and quaint. I also was working really hard and had samples to show and people to vouch for me and all that kind of stuff. But that was really it. I just got a foot in the door by chance, and then once you're in that little community, Hollywood's very similar. Everybody knows everybody after a relatively short period of time, and if you are seen as doing a decent job, a little bit of luck comes into it, word gets around.
Last question.
Should I ask the microphone?
It's coming.
Okay. I'm really inspired by your observer's mentality, and it sounds like you read widely and you pay attention and you listen to things that you hear on the street. I'm curious what advice or wisdom you'd have for us to stay curious and to be an observer, and that could range from the practical to carry a notebook and write things out. How do you stay curious, and how can we be more curious and better observers?
When I first started really working on scripts, I said to myself, I'm just going to keep a file, like a Word document, on my computer, and just if I hear some really clever, weird thing, I'm going to write it down. If I pass somebody on the street and they say a weird thing at a cafe, I'm going to write it down. And I have that file still, and at this point I almost never put anything in it. So I think that's a great thing to do. If you can carry a notepad, if you can, sort of be aware. But if you're really, as you say, if you're really kind of reading and seeing and thinking and engaging in the world, if even a 50th of it sticks with you, you'll be in great shape. Especially when I'm in what I would call a fallow period, where I'm not working on a project or not working on a show, or I'm working on something but I'm bored and I want to do something more fun, I will go to art galleries. I listen to a ton of music. I listen to podcasts. I subscribe to a whole bunch of magazines and I read several newspapers in the morning. I mean, not all cover to cover, but you know, I get up and I look at the New York Times and Politico and Axios and New York Magazine, and I get music magazines, and my wife is, you know, a dietitian. She gets diabetes journals, and if I'm really bored, I'll flip through those. You know, I flip around late at night on TV. And so, you know, I do read entire books, but actually, I'm more of the time, I just skim things and peruse things, and I like magazines and short bursts of things. And a little cool thought or paragraph will just last me for days. You know, I read something, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but there's a guy, Ron Brownstein, who writes for the LA Times, who kind of came up with these phrases, at least he's being credited with these phrases, talking about the Democratic primaries in 2020, that there is among Democratic primary voters, there is a beer track and a wine track. And the nominees always come from the beer track. The nominees always come from the people who appeal to at least some non-college educated voters, more blue-collar voters, more non-white voters, frankly. And it was to make the point that Joe Biden's on the beer track, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, pretty much everybody else is on the wine track. Although it did say Pete Buttigieg was on the craft beer track. But you know, that's a concept contained in a phrase. It explains something in a very visceral way that is the reason, and I've been talking about this for weeks with my political friends, like all the reasons Biden is at the top of the field even though no one seems enthusiastic about him, and why nobody can touch him, and why a horrible few months as a candidate left him in exactly the same place in the Democratic field, way at the top of it by himself, which is actually starting to change a little bit now. But I was so excited, I had a meeting on something else with one of the executive producers of The West Wing the other day, and I was telling him about this and saying, if we were back in The West Wing, I would be writing an episode tomorrow called Beer Track. Which is my long rambling way of saying, if you just read widely, if you just sample things, you don't even have to take notes. Because if this is something you care about, if you can get to the point where to be able to make a concept like that real to somebody genuinely excites you, then there's no way you're going to forget.
Go ahead. I can't thank you enough, Eli, for being here tonight and sharing these wonderful stories and anecdotes and leaving us with things to reflect on and bring back into our work, no matter what our field is. And you did it in such an engaging and humorous way. So thank you very much. And also thank you, Vicky, for letting me stretch you outside of your comfort zone and sit in the chair of the interview. So thank you both very much.